In my presentation today, I will focus on the encounters between the German-speaking migrants who helped found the settlement of New Bern, North Carolina in 1710, and the Native Americans, primarily Tuscaroras, who lived in the lands surrounding. So the map shows you, and New Bern is right there, and it still is. Although the New Bern settlement, as its name indicates, was a Swiss-led colonizing effort and included Swiss migrants, the majority of its settlers were from the central Rhineland of the Holy Roman Empire. The British called them Palatines, and I will use that term in this presentation. The colony of New Bern was established under the leadership of a minor Bernese noble, Christoph von Grafenried, who, along with other Bernese entrepreneurs, had secured permission from the Carolina proprietors to settle some 100 Swiss peasants at the junction of the Neuse and Trent rivers in North Carolina. During the summer of 1709, while Grafenried was in London, finalizing the details of the settlement, thousands of German-speaking migrants began pouring into Britain. This mass migration, totaling perhaps 20,000 people, traveling mostly as families, had been prompted by propaganda from the Carolina proprietors that hinted that if the migrants could make their way to London, Queen Anne would send them to America for free and give them free land. The British government, which was surprised by this massive influx of migrants, scrambled to resettle them. They eventually arranged to ship about 3,500 of the migrants to New York, where they were to produce naval stores for the British Navy from the pine forests along the Hudson River. Looking for ways to resettle the rest, they quickly accepted Grafenried's offer to take several hundred of them for his venture in North Carolina. Grafenried went to the refugee camps where these people were, and he had no trouble recruiting Palatine families for his colony, carefully selecting about 650 what he determined to be healthy, industrious people. And this is the group that is the focus of my remarks today. To understand European encounters with Native Americans, one should first consider the Europeans' preconceived notions of the Native American other. Although many tracts circulated through the Holy Roman Empire describing Britain's North American colonies and their indigenous people, I'm going to focus on just one, a small book that we know was read by both the Palatine and Swiss migrants who went to New Bern, and that they called the Golden Book. This book, published in Frankfurt in 1709 at the behest of the Carolina proprietors, describes a peaceful land of milk and honey. A map in the book shows Carolina as a wide open land, mostly cleared of forest, crossed by numerous rivers, and inhabited by a few docile animals. The land is devoid of people. No Native Americans are depicted, and their dwellings are limited to the map's periphery. In fact, the book claims that, quote, the largest part of the wonderful country is deserted and uncultivated. It devotes only 3 sentences to the Native Americans, saying that their numbers are low and decreasing, that they, quote, live with our people in perfect peace and in very good friendship, and that they, quote, have no experience in the manner of war, except what they have learned from our people. It is important to understand the political context in which the Golden Book was read. Although its purpose was to promote Britain's colonial ambitions, for the Palatines, as subject, albeit very distantly, of the Habsburg Emperor, these ambitions were not their own, nor their government's. In addition, although the Palatines were now nominally part of a Swiss colonial venture, their Heimat was in the western corner of the Holy Roman Empire, not in Bern. Therefore, in their dealings with their Native American neighbors, they did not necessarily feel themselves limited by the considerations of power that often preoccupied the British colonial elite. Moreover, their own experience living in a decentralized state, divided into small and competing principalities, would have made them well equipped to understand indigenous politics that operated in a similar fashion, and perhaps also made them open to seeing intercultural exchange as something more than a zero-sum game. If we want evidence of this open-minded attitude, it is worthwhile to briefly examine the example of their fellow Palatine migrants who went to New York instead of North Carolina and eventually settled among the Haudenosaunee tribes along the Mohawk River. I don't have time to examine this relationship in depth, but suffice it to say that it was not one the British authorities condoned. For the Palatines of New York, the language of assimilation would be Mohawk first, rather than English or Dutch. They saw the Mohawks and Oneidas as allies in their struggle against the British colonial authorities, and their most important settlements were not on the European side of an imaginary Native American European frontier, but rather farther to the west in the midst of the Haudenosaunee settlements. 50 years after arriving in New York, if we are to believe English translations of their self-description, they were, quote, no longer white people, but Oneidas, and their blood was mixed with the Indian. I'm not arguing that there was something inherent in the nature of German-speaking migrants from the Holy Roman Empire that somehow made them friends of the Native Americans. In fact, you'll see in a minute that this is clearly not true. My point is that there was at least the possibility of accommodation and even friendship that I would argue originated in part in the social and political environment from which the migrants emerged. And nothing in the propaganda that the migrants read about America would have contradicted that possibility. Yet, as I've hinted, the nature of Palatine Native American encounters in North Carolina was much different from that in New York. To understand these differences, one must understand the different migration experience of the Palatines. In New York, the Palatines distrusted the British colonial authorities, believing that they were using the naval stores operation to and serve them. In this situation, the Mohawks appeared as understanding allies. The New Bern Palatines, however, reacted not so much to unfulfilled promises as to the trauma of a deadly Atlantic crossing and their desperate first months in America. Both the Palatines of New Bern and their fellow Swiss migrants traveled through England on their way to America, but they sailed at different times and with radically different outcomes. The Palatines sailed first, leaving England in January 1710 on 2 ships packed with 650 people. The crossing took 13 weeks, at a time when a typical crossing was 8 to 10 weeks, and anything longer risked disease and death. By the time the Palatines arrived off the coast of Virginia in mid-April, over half the migrants had died. To add to their misery, just before reaching the harbor at Hampton, Virginia, they were attacked by French privateers who robbed them of their clothing and few belongings. Because North Carolina had no deep water port, the Palatines had to then tramp overland into North Carolina and then by small boat and foot until they eventually arrived at the site of the plan for the new settlement. For 5 long months after they left London, they arrived in the land of milk and honey, naked and starving. Meanwhile, the ship carrying Grafenried, along with 106 Swiss migrants, left England in late July 1710 and arrived in Virginia in just 6 weeks. Not a single migrant died on the voyage, and although they too had to travel overland to their destination, they arrived in New Bern undiminished in health or in numbers. They were overjoyed by all they saw around them, with one exception: the naked, penniless, starving Palatines who were to be their neighbors. Grafenried realized that for the sake of the Palatine survival and for the morale of the colonists as a whole, he needed to allocate land as quickly as possible. Although the modern town of New Bern has its roots in this Swiss venture, the original settlement was actually a dispersed agricultural community. Grafenried laid out a village where he and a number of artisans lived, but the majority of Swiss and Palatines were given 250-acre grants of land along the Trent River, which actually runs to the west, but in this map it's running to the north, and you can see these little tent-like structures are actually where each of the families was settled. It actually stretches 15 miles west, so this was not a very well protected colony. It is clear from Grafenried's map of the colony that along with a few English and French settlers in the region, Native Americans also lived in adjoining lands. While Grafenried, in his history of New Bern, sometimes describes Native Americans in a disparaging and condescending way, he admits that they are strong negotiators, and his initial encounters with them were businesslike and generally cordial. But beyond what we glean from Grafenried's account, what do we know about encounters between Native Americans and the Swiss and Palatine migrants? Unfortunately, we have no direct accounts from the Palatines, but 10 letters sent by the Swiss migrants back to their families and friends survive. Only half the letter writers mention the Native Americans at all, and their comments are limited to a sentence or two. They distinguish themselves from their indigenous neighbors by remarking on the natives' nakedness, although they then describe their clothing, and their lack of interest in Christianity. Although one person describes the natives as, quote, unsuited for work, others express a more positive view using terms like good-natured, clever, and not savage. It is clear that there is some degree of interaction mainly centering on trade, but on the whole, the Swiss find the Native Americans literally unremarkable and seemingly little different from their European neighbors. I should mention that the Swiss found the Palatines even more unremarkable. Only one letter mentions them at all. Although the Swiss letter writers never distinguished one native group from another, there were several different indigenous communities all around them, including tribes of Algonquian, Siouan, and Iroquois people. Most of the tribes living near the coast had already been severely diminished by disease and warfare, and the dominant native nation in the region, which lived further inland, was the Tuscaroras, an Iroquois group that maintained contact with the tribes of the Iroquois heartland in New York. The various native tribes were often in conflict with one another, and when they allied themselves with the Europeans, they did so not simply as a matter of survival, but as a way of furthering their own interests versus other indigenous groups. Still, as the number of Europeans increased, as more and more firearms were imported into the region, and as more people competed for resources, intertribal power relations were destabilized. Although the Tuscaroras were the dominant tribe, they did not establish hegemonic stability. In fact, they lived in confederated but independent communities with separate leaders who were not always in agreement with one another. Certainly, they were united in their understanding of the European threat, but they were not necessarily in agreement on the best course of action in the face of this invasion. Despite the Golden Book's description of a land almost devoid of people, New Bern had been plopped down in a land of many peoples and many competing interests. To his credit, Grafenried seemed aware of the situation and the tensions it caused. When in the late summer of 1711, the English explorer John Lawson, who lived near New Bern, suggested that he and Grafenried explore possible western routes that might connect New Bern with Virginia, Grafenried was anxious about the proposition, not wanting to upset the Tuscaroras through whose land the route would necessarily pass. Nevertheless, the two of them set out with 2 enslaved Africans and 2 Native American guides into Tuscarora land. 2 days into the journey, a native contingent surrounded and captured the men. The Tuscaroras and their native allies were determined to stop further European incursions. They were divided, however, over what to do next. Initially, they decided to let the captors go, but the arrival of other tribal leaders and a squabble between Lawson and some of his captors caused the native leaders to reconsider their decision. Soon, Grafenried and Lawson found themselves bound, unclothed, and de-wigged, and along with one of Grafenried's slaves, seemingly awaiting their execution. Grafenried made a fascinating drawing of the scene, a rare picture of an encounter between Europeans and Native Americans, where Native Americans clearly have the upper hand. This drawing is housed today at the Brugger Bibliothek in Bern, and I'd be happy to discuss it further at the end of our presentation. Although the drawing centers on the fate of 3 men, the Tuscaroras were actually considering a much larger question: how to deal with the European colonists as a whole. The Tuscaroras did not speak with one voice. Some apparently only wanted to threaten the captives, avoiding war but making it clear they would suffer no new incursions. Others wanted to send a stronger message. It is not clear whether this group favored all-out war to push the Europeans out of Carolina, or perhaps more likely that they believed a forceful but short-term military action would give the clear message that they were unwilling to cede any more lands. Regardless of how they saw the final outcome, the group favoring warfare won out. Still, the Tuscaroras remained divided, and several villages withheld their support. When it came to the captives' fates, the Tuscaroras decided to execute Lawson, to free the enslaved African, and to allow Graffenried to live, although he remained a captive for another 6 weeks. During his captivity, the Tuscaroras and their allies unleashed a deadly attack on the New Bern settlers and the other colonists in the region. When Graffenried was released and returned to New Bern, he was surrounded by devastation. The outlying farms had been plundered and burned. Around 70 of the German-speaking settlers had been killed and 15 taken captive. Of the 750 original Swiss and Palatine migrants, only about 300 were still living, and many had now left New Bern, dispersing across North Carolina. The attack was the opening salvo of the so-called Tuscarora War, which would continue over the next 2 years. Initially, a small number of North Carolina settlers, including many Palatines, worked to defend the European settlements, but they were easily defeated by the Tuscaroras. The Tuscaroras apparently singled out the Palatines as hapless opponents, referring to their disagreeable looks and their gibberish speech filled with yah, yah, yah. Eventually, South Carolina sent a small militia group along with 600 indigenous allies to take on the Tuscaroras. In a series of battles, this army subdued the Tuscaroras, burning their homes and crops and killing soldiers and civilians alike. Many of the surviving Tuscaroras left for the north, where they eventually joined their distant Iroquois cousins in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. As a condition of his release, Graffenried had pledged that the New Bern settlers would not take up arms against the Tuscaroras, meaning that the Palatines clearly had the opportunity to remain neutral during the war. But the Palatines were not interested in neutrality. They wanted to drive the Native Americans out. The Palatines' hostile actions angered Graffenried, and he noted with disgust that at least one of the Palatines eagerly took part in the torture and murder of a Native American captive. If we can believe Graffenried, the Palatines differed from their fellow Swiss migrants in the violence they showed the Tuscaroras. They also differed markedly from their fellow Palatines who had ended up in New York. The New York Palatines, upset with ill treatment by the British colonial authorities, had seen the Haudenosaunee as their allies and fellow sufferers at the hands of the British. They had lived among them as neighbors for 50 years and more, sometimes squabbling, as neighbors often do, but also coming to their aid and occasionally intermarrying with them. So why were the New Bern Palatines encounters marked by violence instead of accommodation? As I've suggested, several factors can affect the way migrants interact with the people they encounter. Two of these factors, I would argue, help determine the range of possible interactions, what the possibilities are, but they do not necessarily preordain one outcome or another. The first of these, for the New Bern Palatines, was the social, cultural, and political milieu from which they emerged. The fact that they moved as families, that they came from the splintered periphery of the Holy Roman Empire, and that they had hitched on to a colonizing effort not related to a political entity to which they belonged, all created a certain range of possibilities for interacting with the Native Americans. Second, the promotional literature for Carolina that they had been exposed to also shaped the possibilities they imagined for such interaction. But although these factors certainly affected the migrants' attitudes towards the Native Americans, they did not lead them down a single path. Indeed, what mattered most had little to do with background, political identity, or propaganda. It was instead the migration experience itself. And for the Palatines, this was one of upheaval and loss. Over half died on the Atlantic crossing. Pirates stole their clothing and possessions. They then endured a long overland trek to a hostile and hot environment with little food or assistance. Once in North Carolina, they were neglected and half-starved before Grafenried and the Swiss arrived. And although given land to support themselves, there was little sense of community, and their Swiss neighbors seemingly ignored them. Many died at the outbreak of the Tuscarora War, and others were lost to captivity. In the end, trauma and desperation drove them to throw their lot with the European settlers who were determined not to live with the Native Americans, but to drive them out. When three groups of people, the New York Palatines, the New Bern Swiss, and the New Bern Palatines, all coming from relatively similar backgrounds and sharing similar preconceived notions of the Native Americans, end up reacting to the process of encounter in different ways, then it seems that although culture, politics, and propaganda all play an important part in shaping intercultural contact, we can never escape the importance of the participants' day-to-day experiences in ultimately determining how such contacts will play out. Thank you.